Okay, so before we go, we should talk about the significant development in the last 24 hours, which is that it appears like Chris Paul's tenure with the Suns could be coming to an end. Now, I know there's different reporting out there. What I will say from what Woj reported and what I've been told, the Suns did meet with Chris Paul on Wednesday. They laid out what their situation is. None of it was a surprise to anybody. Chris Paul's very shrewd. He knew this was coming. They basically have three options. They can guarantee his full contract by June 29th to take his guarantee from 15.8 to I think 30.2 million. They can waive him and take the full 15.8 million on their books this year. And he would be a free agent. The reason they would do that is that they would leave open the possibility of him to re-sign if he didn't like his choices elsewhere. If they do that, if they waive him and just take the full hit on their books this year, they would get their salaries down where they would have the taxpayer mid-level exception. So what is that, Bontemps, like $7 million?
Around $7 million-ish.
Okay.
Yeah.
If they waive and stretch him, which is they waive him and then stretch the money they owe to him over the course of 5 seasons, they would actually be able to clear enough room that they could use the full mid-level exception, which is about $11 million, and the biannual exception of 4.5 million. But the idea of bringing him back is not on the table in that regard. Right. So they can, and the real issue here is with the new rules, they're going to have 4 guys who make over $30 million: Ayton, Chris Paul, Booker, Durant. It really hamstrings them. And so they, I think, explained to Chris that there was a decent possibility that he was going to get waived. They could trade Ayton between now and June 29th. Right. They could make another move that would make having Chris at $30 million make more sense. But let's just be honest. In all likelihood, he's going to get waived, because I just said it opens up the possibility for them to add players, including maybe even keep him and add a player.
Right.
And the other thing, he's not a $30 million player.
Yeah, that's sort of the low-key part of this whole discussion, is that he just wasn't all that good last season. And he
was fine, but he wasn't a $30 million player.
He wasn't, right. He wasn't Chris Paul anymore. He was just a nice point guard.
He's 38 years old, obvious durability issues. And when I was in Phoenix during the West semifinals, the conversations that I was having were, obviously he's hurt during that series, but essentially they were going to explore ways of, hey, can we turn CP3 into maybe a couple of quality role players? And, as you said, maybe one of those role players is him, plus who they can get on an exception. But that's what makes the idea of waiving and stretching interesting, because, you say, well, hold on, you're losing him for nothing. But Wendy, as you point out, what you're doing there is creating a couple of salary slots where you can add players.
Well, and this
during the playoffs, as you know, MacMahon, I covered the first round series, you covered the second round series. Devin Booker was kind of their point guard.
Yeah.
For a
and
lot
we
of
talked
time.
about it last night. Like, who was the Miami Heat's point guard when they beat the Mavericks in 2006? It was essentially Dwayne Wade. James Harden actually officially became a point guard. I think Devin Booker is it's heading that way with him. The risk there is, boy, you're asking an awful lot of him. But he's going to have the ball in his hands an awful lot. And then when he doesn't, KD will.
Yeah, I just think this whole thing underscores how tight a spot Phoenix is in. They traded everything they had to get Kevin Durant, which obviously is an understandable thing to do. But those 4 guys, as you point out, Brian, they make more than the salary cap next season if you have Chris Paul on the team. That's why all this is being discussed. Even if Chris Paul was at Chris Paul level still, you'd have to wonder if that was sustainable given the restrictions that are coming to these teams. And we spent the whole playoffs talking about how Phoenix's depth was not good enough. And if they have all 4 of those guys on their books, they have very few ways to meaningfully upgrade the rest of that roster. And you just look at Denver and them going into next season, it's hard to make any real argument that Denver wouldn't beat them again if they have a similar assortment of players coming back. And when you're talking about Kevin Durant entering his late 30s with a pretty limited window to try to win with him, this is the summer where they've got to try to find a way to upgrade this roster. And whether that's finding a trade for DeAndre Ayton, which I think is going to be a lot easier said than done, or finding a way to maximize what they can get out of Chris or that salary slot, it just really speaks to what I think is just a really tight box that they're in to try to get this team to the level of these other super elite teams, because there's just very little on the roster that you like outside that top end talent.
So if I'm sorry, go ahead, Wendy.
If Chris Paul becomes a free agent, there's obviously going to be quite a few teams interested.
I talked to a couple last night that were interested just at the possibility of it.
I find it hard to believe that Chris, at this point in his life, based on what I know about him, would not want to be near his family,
right?
Who are in LA. And so if it's not LA, either the Lakers or Clippers, both of them have free agent point guards that they may or may not keep. I think coming back to Phoenix is on the table. I know that there are other teams that would be great for him. I wouldn't say this is ironclad. I would just, knowing what I know about Chris, I would be surprised if he doesn't want to be very close to his family.
Right. And that's what I was going to ask. If not Phoenix, which again, even if he is waived, as long as he's not stretched, is still a possibility, then where? And you answer that because it's a couple things. And I think in this order, family, and what is the one thing that Chris Paul is missing basketball wise that he desperately wants?
Well, winning the title. Yeah.
So like we can talk about Chris Paul as like I saw somebody on Twitter talking about CP3 in San Antonio. Like, hey, he'd be an awesome mentor for that young group. But like, why does that make sense for Chris Paul at this stage of his career?
No way.
No way.
I think the place that makes sense is the Lakers. D'Angelo Russell isn't good enough. We saw that in the playoffs. If Chris Paul's willing to play on a minimum in Phoenix, let's say that's on the table, right? We talked about how the Lakers have some limitations financially, even if they bring back their guys. Like, I think even at this point, he's a pretty clear upgrade to me on D'Angelo Russell in the playoffs. And if you have Chris Paul on that team, you finally have all the banana guys will have then play with LeBron officially, and he gets to go back home.
I think he points something out. He does have injury issues that happen all the time in the playoffs. Just keep in mind that he would not be a $30 million player. When you sign a guy to a minimum contract, your expectation of him is different.
Yeah.
I don't know how he would play with LeBron, to be honest with you. Talk about two alpha males, dogs.
But think about it though.
He's done it.
Tim.
Listen, there were the same questions. This is when he was in his prime. How's he going to play with James Harden? I understand that thing went south in year 2. In year 1, though, they had the most wins in the league, and Chris Paul played off the ball other than when, he's running the second unit and thrived. And like, look, at this point, Chris Paul doesn't need to have the ball in his hands all the time. That's probably asking too much. I think he's can be a very effective spot up shooter, secondary playmaker. Now, I think the biggest drop off for CP3 has been he was an all defensive guy for a long time, and now he's a guy you've got to you got to kind of hide defensively. But in giving him the easiest assignment, he's going to communicate like a madman, like to the point where guys maybe get tired of hearing his voice. And he's not going to blow assignments. He's not going to fall asleep defensively and kill you on that end, which, let's just be honest, that is a pretty drastic difference from the guy that they had starting at point guard throughout the playoffs until they pulled the plug on him in game 4.
Well, and if you're having him
finals.
Well, and if you're having him run your second unit, right, and basically being your point guard when LeBron's on the court, not on the court, what's he going to be doing? He's going to be running pick and rolls with Anthony Davis, who can serve as a backline anchor to make up for some of those defensive issues, right? So again, like if you're talking about spending 18, 20, 25 million on D'Angelo Russell, or in theory, having, Chris Paul on a minimum with some other options to supplement him around that, I don't think it's much of a question to me as to what I think would be the better path forward. But again, we're a long ways away from that happening.
What if you're the Clippers and you've got Russ who wants to come back and you've got Chris Paul?
I mean, I think Chris Paul's probably a better fit, but
let's see if Russ wants to come back at that price first.
All right. Fair
enough.
A good what if.
It's a good what if.
Okay. We'll see. By the way, I can just tell you, stuff's heating up in the league. This finals, we still got to see what the Miami Heat if you count them out. I can't help you if you count them out.
Right.
I won't be. But there's stuff in the league starting to heat up. The phones are ringing, stuff starting to go. So the offseason's on the cusp of happening, and there's going to be action, and Chris Paul's just the first of many dominoes. We'll be covering it all here on the Hoop Collective.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN Plus right now.